أن ننتقل مباشرة إلى الجلسة الثانية، واسمحوا لي هنا أن أدعو ميسرة الجلسة السيدة غادة عمار، وهي المذيعة وفي قناة المملكة وخبيرة الإعلام والاتصال، للتفضل إلى المنصة هي وضيوفها. واسمحوا لي أن أشير إلى عنوان الجلسة القادمة: التعددية قيد التطبيق، أمثلة حية على الجهود الأمم المتحدة السياسية والإنسانية والتنموية في المنطقة. وسيتحدث في هذه الجلسة السيد هانس غروندربرغ، المبعوث الخاص للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة إلى اليمن، والسيد سكوت أندرسون، نائب المنسق الإنساني للأمم المتحدة ومدير شؤون الأونروا في غزة. غادة عمار، floor is yours.
شكرا جزيلا حسين. السادة الكرام، أهلا وسهلا بكم. سنبدأ هذه الجلسة. سأقوم بسؤال العديد من الأسئلة باللغة العربية، ومن ثم لمن يرغب بالترجمة سيكون هناك ترجمة مضافة. في بعض المداخلات سننتقل ما بين العربية والإنجليزية للسماح بتواصل فعال بشكل أكبر. إذن أهلا وسهلا بالجميع مرة أخرى. إذن نتوجه الآن إلى هذه الجلسة الثانية، حيث ينضم إلي كل من السيد هانس غروندبرغ، وهو المبعوث الخاص للأمم المتحدة في اليمن. قليلا عن السيد هانس: دبلوماسي ذو خبرة تزيد عن 20 عاما في الشؤون الدولية، مع تركيز خاص على الشرق الأوسط. أهلا وسهلا بك سيد هانس. وكذلك ينضم إلينا السيد سكوت أندرسون، وهو نائب المنسق الإنساني للأمم المتحدة ومدير عمليات الأونروا في غزة. يقود فريقا في غزة، فريقا ضخما يعمل على الإغاثة، وكذلك أيضا يدير عملية إغاثة متعددة الوكالات، ويتمتع بخبرة واسعة في القيادة الإنسانية، بما في ذلك خلال الأزمات السابقة في غزة. اليوم نسعى لإيضاح هذا العمل بمنهجيته. تفضل. إذن من جديد نرحب بضيوفنا الكرام. كانت هناك فقط نبذة قصيرة عن خبرتهم الواسعة، هذه الخبرة التي تجلت في عدة مناطق نزاع، والكثير من الحلول المطروحة والممارسات والنهج المتبع في الوصول إلى طرق إغاثية عدة، وكذلك إلى حلول سياسية على أرض الواقع. اليوم ستكون هناك دراسات معمقة، على الأقل أمثلة واقعية من الميدان، وكذلك أيضا بعض الانعكاسات وبعض الملاحظات حول ما يمكن العمل حوله في ظل هذه الأوضاع والتطورات التي يشهدها الإقليم. سأبدأ بداية مع السيد هانس غروندبرغ. سيد هانس، عندما نتحدث بداية عن اليمن بالتحديد، نحن نتحدث عن مثال ممتد لسنوات عدة. إذا ما أردنا أن نقيم الأوضاع حاليا، خاصة فيما يتعلق بالعمل الإغاثي الخاص، وكذلك على المستوى السياسي بدور الأمم المتحدة، وصولا إلى ما هو الوضع عليه الآن في اليمن.
Thank you. Answering that question is in five minutes is close to impossible. But first, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, let me just say thanks to Sherry, the resident coordinator here in Jordan, for setting this up. I think this is an excellent opportunity to talk about the need for multilateralism and the need to also re-emphasize on what the UN is and what the UN is about, and why we need the UN and just don't take it for granted, exactly in the way that the discussion previously, which I listened to very carefully, was into. Coming to Yemen, I think, in answering your question, yesterday, I participated in a discussion with an entity in the UN that is overviewing all the political missions and the envoys' offices, and trying to re-evaluate and see whether it makes sense to have envoys and what the added value of these missions are. And I have to say that in my discussions with them and in my answers, I felt very at ease in defending the role of the United Nations when it comes to the work that we're doing in Yemen. And one of the reasons for that is that I believe that Yemen is very much a case in point for the need of a multilateral approach with an entity such as the UN in the lead when it comes to mediation efforts in Yemen. And we have seen that for the last years, a situation in which the international community, the regional stakeholders, and the Yemeni parties themselves have very much been unified under the need for an impartial third party to lead the mediation efforts when it comes to settling the conflict. So from that point of view, it has given a space for the United Nations, for the envoy, for my office, and for my colleagues to engage in serious discussions in finding solutions on the ground, which we have done. And let us not forget, 3 years ago, Yemen was in a state of war. Only 3 years ago, if you think about December 2021, missiles were flying across the border. The front lines inside Yemen were in full state of war. And since then, we've seen a period after the establishment of the UN-brokered truce in April 2022. We've seen a period of relative calm inside Yemen, and we've seen a period of a situation where the conflict inside Yemen has subdued. And that could not have taken place unless there was a serious coordination and cooperation between the United Nations, the region, the parties, and the international community and the Security Council. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise. No member state could have mediated the issues that we have mediated and provided the solutions and provided the space for discussions unless we had the setup that we have right now. I'm not saying this to take the credit for myself. I'm not saying this to say that it's only the UN that has delivered, but it's the context, the international context where the parties of a conflict, the regional backers in that conflict, and the broader international community work hand in hand together with a leadership provided by the United Nations to deliver solutions. That works. In Yemen, it works. And yes, we are in a situation where right now the setup in the region and the latest year, the horrific development for the last year has complicated the mediation space in Yemen. That goes without saying. But I don't for one second doubt on the ability and the possibility for the parties to come to an agreement when it comes to the situation in Yemen and under the auspices of the United Nations in coordination and collaboration with the region and with the support of the Security Council. Thanks.
شكرا لك. سؤال تعقيبي على ما تفضلت بذكره فيما يتعلق بهذه العملية. نحن طبعا نتحدث عن سنوات طويلة شهدت الكثير من التحديات، لم تأتي بين ليلة وضحاها هذه النتائج. أشرت في حديثك بأن الفضل لا يعود للأمم المتحدة وإنما هو عمل تشاركي طبعا بقيادة الأمم المتحدة في كثير من الحيثيات، وهذا ما يرتبط أيضا بما تفضلت وذكرته السيدة الأستاذة شيري أندرسون في بداية الكلمة الافتتاحية عندما تحدثت عن أن عمل الأمم المتحدة ونجاحها مرتبط بتعدد الأطراف والشركاء على الأرض. إذا ما أردنا أن نربط خاصة قبل أن نتوجه للسيد سكوت، لربما يختلف السياق ولكن التحديات ترتبط، وعند التطرق للعمل السياسي العائق الأول يكون في الظروف التي يعيشها المدنيون. عندما نتحدث عن الحصار، عندما نتحدث عن المجاعات التي شهدها اليمن، اليوم قد يبدو هذا الطرح مستحيلا، فكيف تم تحقيق نوع من التوازن ما بين الظروف التي قد تكون مستحيلة وما بين النتائج التي نطرحها إذا استطعنا أن نسميها كيس ستدي أو قضية دراسية نسلط الضوء فيها على المخرجات؟
No, it's a very good question, and it's a difficult one because the United Nations work, if we take the example of Yemen, the United Nations work there is divided into, you have the long-term presence inside Yemen, which is consisting of all the different agencies that are delivering on the humanitarian needs, on the development needs, and on other type of needs, which is led and coordinated through the resident coordinator. And then you have my mission, the Office of the Special Envoy, which is dealing with the settling of the political crisis or the war first, and then trying to reinstate a political process that then can normalize the situation in Yemen. There is a necessity for the United Nations to work in tandem, where the work that I do needs to be able to continue and to be able to deliver, while the work of the different agencies under the guidance of the resident coordinator needs to also be able to work in slight independence from the issues that are happening on the political ground. That generates always complications, and there is a need for coordination, there is a need of collaboration between my office, the resident coordinator, and all the agencies to make sure that we are able to provide for the needs inside Yemen. When it comes to how you approach this, at least from my side and from the work that I have been doing with my colleagues, is to set out first a long-term approach, a long-term goal, and then be very clear with all sides, with the Yemenis, with the region, and with the international community, with the Security Council, to be very clear about and open about this. These are the goals that we want to attain, and try not to surprise anyone about what we're doing. And then you set out a strategy to reach that goal. But then you need to be very, very clear about the fact that that strategy will never be a straight line. It will be a zigzag, and you will have to change tactics, but you don't change strategy very often, and you approach it on a step-by-step basis. Wahda wahda, you build a foundation for a peace process moving forward. But you then always need to be in close coordination and close collaboration with the rest of the UN family, such as Scott here, but he's not in Yemen, he's in Palestine, but still he will have the same type of relationship with the UNSCO, the political officers there, and making sure that the whole of the UN knows what it is doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, I'll be shifting between English and Arabic. So, relating to what Mr. Hans just mentioned, we talk about different history, we talk about different elements, but we talk about almost a similar context, especially when we talk about the casualties, when we talk about the damages, the losses in the civilians' souls and numbers. Eventually, when we talk about the approaches, the catastrophic situation currently in Gaza, does that allow for a similar approach, especially with the updates and with the escalations that we've been seeing recently?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me here for the organization. I always feel odd thanking my wife, but thank you your office for the organization. Just maybe for a little context, so 2 million people in Gaza, and everybody's in need right now. Right? Everybody's been displaced. Many people have been displaced more than 10 times, one time a month, and every time they move, they lose wealth. It costs money, they lose assets. So what we have now is everybody's in need, and they're wholly reliant on the United Nations or the international humanitarian community to meet their basic needs, which is food, water, medical care, solid waste management, getting ready for winter a second time. And it requires all parts of the system working together for us to be able to do that. Right? Not one entity within the UN can meet all those needs. It takes everybody working together hand in hand. But what it also takes is access and an enabling environment. And that's where we've had problems in Gaza meeting the needs, because we don't have access to people. There is no law and order, particularly in Rafah, where the only crossing, or the main crossing that comes into Gaza, exists, and it's led to a rise in organized crime, it's led to a rise in looting, led to a rise in protection concerns. So when the UN can operate, when all the parts work together, we do a very good job, actually, at least on the humanitarian side that I'm speaking of, in meeting the needs of the people. But that also relies on member states' donations, but also political support. As Hans said, you can't get all this access without political support. Primarily, I'm a humanitarian, that's what we do, but we do work with the political mission in Jerusalem with UNSCO to try to unlock certain things. We work with the humanitarian coordinator, as well as the country level representatives. And as I said, when we have access, we do a good job. But when you don't have access, you see what we see now in Gaza, which is a looming famine. In August, 1 million people did not receive food aid. In September, it was 1.4 million. In October, it was 1.7 million. Thankfully, it didn't get any higher in November, but that's still most of the population. As was said earlier today, we have 350,000 people that are in Category 5 of the IPC, which is famine-like conditions. So without the political will of the member states, the humanitarian system cannot function optimally, It cannot meet the needs of people that are trapped in a horrible conflict. And it puts us in a situation that's very dangerous for humanitarians. We've lost over 330 humanitarians in Gaza since the conflict began, which I think is more than the UN has lost globally in the last decade. So people are committed, they're dedicated, but it's very dangerous, but they still stay and they try to help. And sometimes the results are quite catastrophic, even when you do everything exactly the way you should do it. There's also mention about the hostages. There's 101 hostages at last report, many different nationalities, well over 40,000 casualties, over 100,000 people injured. We will continue as humanitarians to try to deliver in this difficult context, but the only thing that's going to help move all this forward is a ceasefire. Right? We all know that, although it seems farther away now than it ever has. We remain hopeful that something will happen so we can begin the very long process of rebuilding Gaza. The last thing I'll say about humanitarian aid is it really should be coupled with development, or you just have a continuing situation of need that people are trying to just meet their basic needs, and it's much better if they can be employed, be prosperous, and meet those needs themselves. Thank you.
If we shift a little bit to talk about the challenges, which you already highlighted in parts of your talk, there is different layers of challenges. We talk about the grassroots level, and then we talk about the decision-making level, and then we talk about the global kind of will and intention towards reaching a peaceful solution or anything that serves the grassroots level. So recently we've been hearing the news, especially when it comes to aid delivery, and we know now that even Karm Abu Salim crossing is also a very difficult point where we can at least deliver these kind of aids. However, this balance between two, when you talk about the level of decision making or the international community and the difficulties and the challenges in the field, how can we work towards that, especially when you talk about some sort of withdrawn commitments? We know the challenges that UNRWA has been facing, especially when it comes to the budget. We know the participation. We know that the callings are going out and continuously. However, it's not really crossing over the challenges on all layers so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The challenges are quite significant. And it's also interesting how, what's happening in Gaza does impact the wider region. I know you and I have talked about this, Hans, and how it's even impacted Yemen and things happening there. So for us, our challenges start with the day-to-day work, right? How do we get food in from the crossing today to try to get it to people? How do we counter the smuggling of cigarettes that's taking place, the profiteering of people? And how do you do this all in a context without any blue police? Because there is no law and order, and there's very little municipal type services. So we operate in a vacuum. We coordinate daily with the government of Israel, with the IDF, who are present across Gaza from north to south. And again, sometimes that works and sometimes it does not. The challenges with bringing aid in through what is very much an organized crime environment are significant because you think you have a deal today, but the deal doesn't extend until tomorrow. So every day is a new challenge of how do we get in critically needed aid from the crossing to the people in a way that's safe and doesn't take a life to save a life. Because sometimes that's also a choice that you're faced with. I think the political challenge is much harder to overcome for us. The thing I think that's been the hardest in Gaza throughout this year is there's no international media presence. So there's really nobody to tell the story of what's happening on the ground other than the UN. And as was talked about earlier this morning and throughout the program today, the UN isn't entirely trusted around the world. And the messages are perceived as biased. And despite the fact we attempt to stay neutral throughout all our advocacy efforts, we're living the conflict every day. I see it every day when I go from the guest house where I sleep to the health center where I work, right? You see children going through garbage trying to find food. You see remains on the side of the road. So certainly it impacts us. And that's something else that you have to struggle with as you try to give an unbiased picture to the political level of what's happening in Gaza. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But the politics of the conflict certainly influence what we can do on the ground. They influence our daily operational challenges. And when I last met with the IDF, I said our biggest problem is we're trying to operationally solve a political problem. And that just doesn't work. You need the politics and the operations to align so you can move things forward. So, as I said, we stay committed. We spend a lot of time every day coordinating with various parties to the conflict on the ground to try to get access, to try to get supplies. But absent a ceasefire and a political solution, what's going to continue to happen is the innocent civilians in Gaza are going to suffer from the ramifications of what they're faced with every day.
Mr. Hans, can we say that the scene is familiar when we talk about the challenges in particular? We understand the contextual aspects are different, but again, it's a conflict on the ground, and what happens on the grassroots level definitely impacts any kind of movement and steps to be taken on the international kind of level and also on the policy making.
I believe it's always very, very dangerous to enter into comparing conflicts. It's a bit like, I think it was Tolstoy who said that all happy families look alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And it's very much like that. All conflicts have their own different dynamics, but the challenges to deliver results, there are similarities. And when it comes to the situation in Yemen as such, I think one similarity that Scott raised, which I also want to raise, is the challenges that the UN's ability to deliver has been, that the ability of the UN to deliver support has been challenged by a more dangerous environment to work in. It's not only in Gaza that we've seen that. We've seen it in Yemen as well, where we've seen recently 13 UN staff members being arbitrarily detained, and who some of them are still without any knowledge of where they are. And we've seen that also in Lebanon, where the UN has been attacked, but not only in the Middle East. We've seen that elsewhere as well, where the UN, where there seems to be a developing impunity to attack UN because of views against the UN that are misplaced. And that, I think, is extremely dangerous, and it needs to be countered. And obviously UN has a role in countering that itself, making sure that we show that this is not acceptable. The fact that UN staff members in Yemen are being detained is just not acceptable. But also there is a responsibility to the larger member states to uphold the principles of the United Nations and to defend the UN in that sense, and make sure that the principles that have been accepted for the international cooperation under the United Nations are being upheld. And I think that there is a need for revisiting this to make sure that the support that the UN delivers on a daily basis can continue.
I want to stop at the first point that you highlighted when we talk about how risky and dangerous it is to compare between conflict zones and between the examples that we are talking about, whether we're talking about Yemen, Palestine, what's happening in Gaza, or other countries in the region. And the purpose, honestly, of me asking this question is that this is the overwhelming narrative that we've been hearing from the international community as well, especially from the countries who have some sort of decision and participation towards the destiny of these countries, whether we talk about Yemen, whether we talk about Iraq, and at the end of the day, it's linked to the region aspects and the nature of the region. And this somehow, and you clarify this, please, and correct me if I was wrong, would add more pressure on the UN role, because Mr. Scott just highlighted how important it is to keep addressing how the UN is neutral in its stand and position, and they are the only people who are reporting from Gaza, and yet there is a different stream of this international narrative.
Sorry, can you, what is the question?
Okay. Yeah. We're talking, you just mentioned that it is very risky to compare between the two contexts when we talk about Yemen and when we talk about Gaza. Today, how did you navigate through this? Because the narrative of the international community, who are very much in control of the decision-making or the support that is being done, is different than what's happening in the field or the grassroots level.
No, and I think that what is critical for the UN to remember is that it has a convening power through the fact that it is an impartial, one of the few only impartial global bodies that exists. But in order to remain relevant, it needs to remain impartial. It needs to adhere to the principles that it has and avoid entering into a space where it's seen as a political tool guided by one or the other. And that, I think, has been a very critical approach that I've had in the work with Yemen. I've been very clear that I am the representative of the international community. I'm not the representative of any party. I'm not the representative of any of the regional countries, and I'm especially not the representative of any of the P5 members. I'm the representative of the international community. I report to the Security Council, and I ensure that they find trust in me, not only in me as a person, but in me as an institution. And here, so that's why, and that I think is a reminder to all colleagues working within the United Nations to ensure that to remind yourself all the time about who is it that you represent and what is it that you do, and ensure that you remind yourself about your impartiality and the fact that you represent all. I have been putting a lot of work in ensuring that I have excellent relationship with Russia, excellent relationship with China, excellent relationship with the UK and the US, and with France, with the P5 members. So to the extent that even when the war in Ukraine began, we still were able to keep the P5 meetings, the meetings of the P5, the permanent 5 members of the ambassadors to Yemen, have been upheld in a space where the P5 is not meeting on a regular basis anymore. And that has been upheld, but you cannot do that unless you uphold this level of impartiality.
Thank you. I'll go back to Mr. Scott, and I will start with where Mr. Hans ended, with the word of impartiality. And this has been a challenge, especially when we talk about the distrust or the mistrust in the United Nations and its role, because we've been hearing a lot in the mainstream media as well. And this is probably because of the lack of transparency, of not allowing journalists to report directly from Gaza, and also a navigation towards this mainstream narrative.
I mean, I think that, and I'll speak for myself in that I have a good relationship with Israel, right? Because, as you said, Hans, we have to be impartial. We represent the international community. I don't represent any country. And so we deal with all the member states equally. That has certainly its own challenges, given the context in which we operate. But we try to be impartial, neutral, independent, and focus on the need of the population, which is the reason we're there. And when, I talked earlier about political will and humanitarian access, when that all lines up, it works well.
Yes.
Polio was detected in Gaza. We tested. It was found. But the international community worked together, and we did 2 rounds of immunization. We reached 94% of the target population. So there should be immunity now within Gaza, at least for this year. We'll have to do this again for a couple of years. But it shows that it is possible when all the political actors align and they want an outcome to something. Unfortunately, what we're also seeing the other side of that is when they don't align, and then it just doesn't work, and we don't get enough food to people, and we have very difficult conditions on the ground. Probably the hardest thing that United Nations members do in Gaza is remain impartial. Again, because you're living it every day. Gaza is not very big. The other difference between Gaza and other conflicts, aside from no international media, is people can't leave. There's nowhere to go. right? We talk about Ukraine, and you see a lot of people leaving Ukraine, going to other countries. Yemen, even, you see people leaving. In Gaza, they just don't have that option because the borders aren't open for them. So, as I said, we try to remain impartial. We try to focus every day on what we can accomplish today to help the people that are very much in need. Some days we succeed, and some days, we do not. But I think that the system itself, the humanitarian system of the UN, works. But at the end of the day, it's only a reflection of the political will of the member states. And if you don't have that aligned behind it, then the humanitarian space that we have to operate is not enough, and then you see the consequences of that in real time.
Okay. I'll shift back now to Arabic so that we divide between our audiences. So if you'd like to hear the question again, thank you. إذا تبعا لما تفضلت بالحديث عنه وكافة هذه المعطيات اليوم، إذا ما تحدثنا عن الشراكة متعددة الأطراف والتي هي عنوان العمل التنموي اليوم والعمل التطويري، وكذلك أيضا الوصول والعمل في مناطق النزاع كما نشهد حاليا اليوم. قطاع غزة ينتظره الكثير خاصة بعد وقف إطلاق النار. ما هي الأولويات التي يجب العمل عليها في هذا النطاق للوصول إلى نتائج فعالة خاصة في ظل هذا الدمار الحاصل في القطاع؟
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of priorities, is what I would start with. But number one is meeting basic needs: food, water, healthcare. I think second, something we're working very hard on is to try to resume learning for children. For the last 5 years now, children have not been in a brick and mortar school in Gaza. 2 years of COVID, and now 2 years of the conflict. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say they probably won't be in a brick and mortar school next year either. 2/3 of all buildings in Gaza are destroyed or damaged beyond being safe to use. Every school that we have that's still standing is full of people, 4,000 to 5,000 people that have sought shelter, and there's just not enough space for children. But it's very important that we don't lose a generation educationally. In Gaza, something they're very proud of and should be, they have the highest literacy rates just about anywhere in the world, and the premium they put on education is reflected throughout society. So there will be support from the community. We've done some resumption of learning, but we're talking 35,000 children out of 625,000 that should be going to school every day. The other thing that we focus on besides the basic necessities is we're in an environment where protection of civilians is functionally non-existent, right? And it's not only the protection concerns that arise from the conflict, it's protection concerns that arise from society that's frayed, and that the normal mechanisms of protection that are built into families no longer exist, because they now live next to people they don't know. They live in a neighborhood they don't know. There's little to no privacy because you're in a tent, so you can hear everything that's happening. And our overarching priority is just to try to keep everybody alive until the conflict ends, right? But within that, there's a lot of work that goes on every day to try and meet different needs. To rebuild Gaza, I think the last estimate I saw is it'd take 8 years just to move the rubble that exists. And it's further complicated by unexploded ordnance that's going to be in most buildings, as well as the remains of people that also need to be collected with dignity so they can have a dignified burial and their families can have closure. But all that is, as I said earlier, absent a ceasefire, it's very difficult. Hopefully, we keep hearing whispers. I remember on May 6th, I was actually doing a media interview, I think with CNN, and I heard everybody cheering, or May 5th, pardon me, everybody cheering because it said Hamas had accepted the ceasefire deal. Well, they did, just not the deal that was actually on the table. It was a different one, and then the next day Rafah started. So we've seen a lot of ups and downs. So we try to remain pragmatic, and we try to remain focused on what we have to do every day, and hope that a ceasefire happens soon.
أشكرك. مستر هانز، مع اختلاف الحيثيات واختلاف الظروف ما بين البلدين، عندما نتحدث عن النزاع والصراع بشكل مستمر، وكذلك نتحدث عن ما يأتي ما بعد هذه الأزمات، اليوم إذا أردنا أن نعنون الدروس المستفادة فيما يتعلق باليمن وماذا يمكن أن نستخلص منها، ماذا قد يكون أهمها؟
Thanks. No, if we take it from the context of this conference, which is about multilateralism, it's about how do we work in a broader context of international law. I think that the first lessons learned that I would want to highlight is the necessity for the international community to uphold principles of international law and to remain as principled as possible and to avoid what we have seen lately, which is some form of diplomatic whataboutism, where you defend bad behavior by pointing at other bad behavior elsewhere. The fact that someone else is behaving badly doesn't justify you from behaving badly. There's no way that that can be done. And that we have, as an international community, agreed to a set of international rules and regulations that should govern the way that we want to live together in a way that provides guidance for what is right and what is wrong. And here I believe there is a responsibility for member states of the United Nations to adhere to those principles in a more coherent manner, regardless of where the conflict takes place, because that facilitates the resolution of conflicts, because it provides a sense of security for even smaller countries that there is a broader set of guarantees that things can settle. I think that is critical, and that is for Yemen is going to, if the principles of international law are not respected, the settlement of the conflict in Yemen will not be impossible, but it will be much more difficult, because the support that you then get from the international community, from the Security Council, and from the region is going to be much more transactional and much more complicated to achieve. So that, I think, is the first lessons learned. The second one is, if you don't mind, I have a second recommendation, and that is to uphold space for dialogue. Dialogue even with those with whom you're at war with, I would say, and that is to avoid entering into some form of diplomatic cancel culture that we've seen as well, where you decide that it's not worth talking to someone just because you don't like what that person is doing. How are you ever going to settle your differences if you decide that you cannot talk to the other side? How is that even possible on the scheme of things? I am not under-evaluating the challenges and the difficulties and the pain that it takes, and the courage also it takes to engage with someone that you are at war with. But it's necessary to do so if you want to see real results for the population under your control. And this also goes into the broader space of the international community, where I see some form of cancel culture, where you decide that it's not worth talking to one or the other country because you do not accept what they're doing. There is always space for dialogue, and the dialogue is the only thing that will settle a conflict in the core. And that's the only way that you can actually achieve real conflict resolution. I want here, since we're sitting in Jordan, I want also to highlight the necessity for the member states of the United Nations to provide support for the United Nations as a body. Here I want just to highlight my gratitude to Jordan, and I think it was Dr. Marwan Washer in the previous session who actually highlighted Jordan's good role as a member of the United Nations. And when it comes to Yemen, I have to say that I'm also deeply, deeply grateful for a country such as Jordan, with whom I have had a very close relationship with in terms of not only delivering results that I have achieved, with whom without Jordan I wouldn't have been able to do so. And this has never been easy discussions. It's always complicated, and I'm always asking for too much. But I'm faced with a country which I would want to see others replicating, and that is engaging in serious discussions about solution making. And that is, I think, what Jordan is doing, and I want to here express my thanks for that.
نعم. قد نتطرق إلى هذه النقطة بالتحديد لاحقا بمزيد من التفاصيل حول هذا المثال الذي قد يحتذى به أو يعتمد واتباع خطواته على الأقل في المساهمة الأردنية بالوصول إلى الحلول السلمية فيما يتعلق باليمن أو حتى بمجمل الإقليم. أعود إلى النقطة التي تفضلت بالحديث عنها وهي موضوع الحوار the dialogue. عندما نتحدث عن ضم جميع الأطراف بكافة توجهاتها اليوم هناك حديث عن القومية، النزعة القومية والأساليب الأحادية. من تجربتكم كيف تم العمل على إدماج حتى هذه الأطراف التي قد تأخذ مسارا مغايرا؟
How do you mean in terms of the differences between the parties inside? Well, there's no, it's a pretty straightforward approach. The first thing you need to do is, and that's the most basic philosophical approach. If you want to achieve any type of result, you need to see yourself in the other. I think that with that basic approach, if you are able to see yourself in the other, you then have taken the first most important step in trying to understand where space for solutions are. So I think the first approach when it comes to settling, and we haven't settled the conflict in Yemen, let's be clear, but we have taken serious steps forward, at least during the last years. But the first issue was to ensure, to provide a space for the different parties inside the conflict in Yemen to have a dialogue with the UN as an entity, the mission, the Special Envoy's office, where they felt that they were safe in engaging in serious discussions about solution making, not only pointing out positions. Because the easiest thing you can do is giving your positions and then leave it there and don't expect, and then you close your ears and you don't need to listen to anything else. The more difficult thing is about where can you find compromises, where can you find, and in order to achieve such a difficult discussion where you actually talk seriously about achieving compromises, there needs to be a safe environment and a space where you have absolute trust, and that I think takes time. It takes serious time, and it takes, and I, with all respect for national mediation that is taking place, I'm uncertain that countries themselves with which, and they do have their own interests that they cannot just avoid, they will not be able to have that long-term approach in such a mediation setting. They might deliver result on the short to medium term, but the long-term approach that is necessary if you want to settle a conflict necessitates a body that is free from own national interests and that has a long-term approach in terms of its and that from there I think that you can then work on finding solutions.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, since we were talking about Jordan and Mr. Hans just pointed, I'm sorry if this is a little bit hard, but we're trying to just accommodate both audiences. We just mentioned Jordan and Mr. Hans just referred to the efforts that is led by Jordan on the political level and also on the humanitarian level as well. If we talk about Gaza in particular, we know the work that has been done in regards of aid and still ongoing. Also, we know the stand and the position led by His Majesty King Hussein and the Foreign Ministry in regards to the community efforts and the international community narrative and what's been happening on the Palestinian lands. In that regard, in particular, let's talk about the role of coordination between the UN and the support that is coming from the Jordanian side on different levels.
Yeah, I mean, I first would echo what Hans said about thanking the government of Jordan, who are always looking for pragmatic solutions to problems, be that airlift, be that trucks, different crossings, and the work the hospitals are doing in Gaza. I mean, it's all, we're grateful for all of that and very much appreciate the support because, as I said earlier, the need is great. And I think that this is a good example of where good coordination within the UN works. There are a lot of priorities, a lot of competing priorities for aid to come in, a lot of different actors, both within the United Nations, but also, for example, the Jordanian Hashemite Charity Organization. And all that has to be brought together somehow. And that's where the UN, I think, plays a very good role in prioritizing while also not making anybody feel left out, which is important because they all want to see their donation or their contribution come to Gaza and help alleviate the suffering that we all know exists. So I think that it's done quite well. OCHA, WFP, UNICEF, just to name a few, UNRWA as well, have played a key role in making sure that happens. But also, as I said earlier about political will, it's been the political will of the government of Jordan to make it happen. And when you know that there's political will, it seems like it's easier to find solutions to some of these challenges. And I just wanted to say one thing about what Hans said about communication. One of the Israeli prime ministers said this at one point: you don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies, and the only way you can do that is to talk to them. As you said, you have to be courageous, and it's difficult. But I think that this is, again, where the United Nations role can be leveraged to coordinate these difficult discussions and to try to advance, in this case, a ceasefire in Gaza or in Yemen, but something that would benefit everyone while still meeting the needs of the member states involved. Thanks.
That's an exercise.
You're testing our coordination.
Yes, I'm testing my coordination as well. Shifting the mindset between Arabic and English. That's a good one. نعم، إذا أردنا أن نلقي نظرة مستقبلية اليوم، لربما قد يكون هذا من المبكر، خاصة وأننا ما زلنا نتحدث وننتظر وقف إطلاق النار، ولكن قد تختلف العلاقة وقد يختلف نهج العمل ما بين الظروف التي تحتاج إلى استجابة طارئة وما بين الظروف الاعتيادية. لا أستطيع القول أنها ستكون اعتيادية في قطاع غزة، ولكن على الأقل لن تكون ذات الحال الطارئ. Okay, that's okay. If we're talking about the situation and having a look to the future, we understand there is a difference between the urgency response, and we understand there is a difference between normal situations, despite the difficulty to say that it would be normal in Gaza even after the cease of fire. How would we navigate this? What is the work methodology that is needed between the urgency response and moving towards rebuilding Gaza?
So again, I think this is where the United Nations can play a critical role and leverage the strength of the development sector, working with the humanitarian sector to begin to rebuild after a ceasefire is in place. Look, if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, people aren't going to go home because they don't have homes to go home to. All right, so the need is still going to be significant. They're still going to need food. They're going to need water. They're going to need health care. There's no economy or private sector to speak of, so we're essentially rebuilding a society from the ground up. It's very difficult, but I think within that there's also an opportunity to maybe look at how do we rebuild differently and rebuild for the future, rebuild in a way that's more sustainable for Gaza. But it's key that the three pillars, essentially the UN and member states, work together, which is political, development, and humanitarian. They have to be intertwined. They have to move forward in lockstep, and always with the goal of making sure we're trying to meet the daily needs of people as we also rebuild their lives and rebuild for the future. So I think this is possible. I think that we can leverage the United Nations expertise in this, and if we all work together and have the political will to move this forward, it's certainly possible.
Okay. I was just notified that we have maybe up to 10 minutes, so we will try to summarize as much thoughts as possible, and I will continue in English if you allow me to. So You mentioned many times that the intention needs to be there and the will, especially from the international community. Looking as an observer and someone who already went to Gaza many times, and you are on different aspects of the functionality of the work of UNRWA there, do you feel that the commitment, the will is there, or do we need more utilization, more advocacy towards that?
Thank you. I haven't talked much about UNRWA. I've talked mostly about Gaza and the larger need and the larger humanitarian system. For as long as there's been the refugee community in Gaza, the one constant they've had in their lives is UNRWA. Through all the ups and downs, through all the setbacks, through all the successes, UNRWA was always there. And that hasn't changed in this conflict, despite some constraints that we face. We very much remain the backbone of the response in Gaza. A couple examples of that are in healthcare. We do 16,000 medical consultations every day. That's 6 million a year, in case you're wondering. And within each of those consultations is potentially a life-saving intervention for somebody. It could be insulin, it could be blood pressure medicine, vaccinations for children. And that's very much the first line of defense against an outbreak of disease and to try to prevent the onset of famine. We're providing food for 1 million people. We provide shelter and support for 1 million people. We generate 800,000 liters of drinking water every month, and we pick up thousands of tons of garbage every year. We are interwoven within Gaza, and UNRWA is very much Gaza is UNRWA. And all that's currently at risk with the current bills that the Knesset has passed. And there is certainly the potential, and please note I said potential, and this is not necessarily a necessity, that Gaza would have to cease to operate in Palestine. It would be catastrophic from a humanitarian perspective because there is no one that can step in within the United Nations and do what UNRWA does. We directly implement, unlike the rest. WHO does not run health centers. UNICEF does not run schools. They advise on how to do all this, and they do that part very well, but they're not direct implementers. So, if there would need to be a transition away from UNRWA, it certainly can't happen by January 28th. It would need to be well planned and well thought out to make sure that a community of innocent civilians that are already very vulnerable don't suffer even more catastrophic results because UNRWA is no longer there. So certainly more advocacy is needed. And ideally the bill would be frozen while we figure out a larger transition. And then equally important, funding needs to continue for UNRWA during all this so we can continue to deliver the life-saving interventions that we do every day in Gaza, as well also now as Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank. In 4 of the 5 fields, we face conflict. So the need is as great as ever. UNRWA's role certainly as a pillar in all the fields, and advocacy to make sure that we remain robust, relevant, and able to respond as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hans, your reflection on what Mr. Scott just mentioned, especially when it comes to rebuilding, at least in the Yemeni context.
No, and I think that this goes for both sides, is that rebuilding or one issue, when you separate from the humanitarian development and the political development, the humanitarian aid in a context like Yemen has been there for so many years, and it's frustrating that you don't take the next step, that we haven't made enough progress to shift over from humanitarian delivery to reconstruction already. And I assume that when you do the assessment of the needs in Gaza, they must be even. They must. I can only think. I don't understand how you even approach the needs that are there right now. But they need to be approached in a certain way. But my point is, all the aid that the UN, through generous support from donors and from member states, can deliver will never be sustainable unless you have serious political settlement of the areas where they are in. There is no way, because otherwise you will see a return to renewed conflict and renewed destruction, renewed misery, renewed pain, and renewed need for humanitarian aid. So again, there is a need beyond just allowing access, allowing funding, allowing UN workers to do their job. Beyond that, there is a need of a collective approach from the international community and from the region to take a serious approach to the conflicts that are taking place and try to address them to the core with a long-term approach. And here I believe that there is space for the UN here to take a more forward-leaning approach. I believe that there is absolute space for the UN to be more forward-leaning also in relationship with the Middle East, where I think that there is a possibility to work together with a number of the countries in this region to assist not only easing of suffering in the conflict areas that we see, but also settlement of the conflicts to the core and in a long-term fashion.
I think the time would allow us for final words about what we have discussed and what you've both highlighted. However, I would like to say, standing in Jordan in particular and the region as a whole, these are not the best days that we're having. We have stability, we have security in Jordan, and yet we're very interconnected and relevant to the Palestinian people and also what's been happening in the region over the past years.
And to the Yemeni people.
Yes, this is what I was referring to. So if we wanted, through those days, what would be our final message or your words towards the multilateral work and approaches according to these recent experience over the years?
I think my summary is and in connection with the debate that took place earlier, and I think that there is a need of questioning and a need of debate about what the UN is and what the UN represents. So that I think is extremely welcome. But similarly, you will, if you break the UN to the core, to the extent that it's not there anymore, you will miss the days when it was there and delivered. And you will do that. So the idea here is not to break the UN. The idea here is to make sure that it can, through a serious support from member states, be able to not only deliver on the immediate needs, but also deliver on the political needs that this region is going through. I am a firm believer in the Middle East. It's a region I've been working with for over 20 years, 25 years. I love the Middle East. I think it's an area which is resounding very deeply with me, and I believe that there is space for the Middle East to find stability, and here the UN is a body that can assist the Middle East in that journey.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
I would agree, I guess, what Hans said. I've been here nearly 17 years, off and on. I love the Middle East. I love Palestine and Israel, Jordan, all of it. I do think there's a multilateral role here to help continue to bring stability to the region. Despite the dark times that we're in now, I do think there's a way to move forward. But that can only work, as I said, if the political development and humanitarian are all aligned. If you try to do one without the others, it just doesn't work. You don't have the support and everything needed to move it all forward. And in Gaza, where I am, as I said, there's 2 million people that are wholly reliant on the system every day for their continued survival. And if you break the UN and there is no UN, then those people have no one. So we need to, I would agree, there's always room for reform, there's always room for improvement, but I think we can't lose focus of the reason we're here, which is to help take care of people first and foremost.
Thank you so much for your time and for the highlights that you provided in this discussion. شكرا جزيلا للمتحدثين معنا في هذه الحلقة النقاشية. كان معنا السيد هانس جراندبرغ المبعوث الخاص للأمم المتحدة إلى اليمن، وكذلك السيد سكوت أندرسون نائب المنسق الإنساني للأمم المتحدة ومدير عمليات الأونروا في غزة. شكرا جزيلا لكما.
واسمحوا لي في هذا المقام أن أشكر ميسرة الجلسة الصديقة العزيزة غادة عمار. شكرا جزيلا لك غادة ولجهودك في هذه الجلسة. إلى هنا ينتهي مؤتمرنا هذا الذي تضمن جلستين اثنتين تحدثنا فيها بصورة رئيسية عن التعددية الأطراف والجهود، إضافة إلى ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، وكم لهذا العنوان دور في هذه المرحلة تحديدا. ليس الهدف إطلاقا أن نفكك الأمم المتحدة ولا عودة عنها، لأننا نحتاجها اليوم أكثر من ذي قبل. فأنا بعتقد بأنه اليوم يمكن الرسالة وصلت من عمان بأننا بحاجة إلى دعم الأمم المتحدة أكثر فأكثر في مناطق النزاع، ودعم وتقديم الخدمات الإنسانية لجميع المتضررين. من قلب عمان، معهد السياسة والمجتمع، مكتب منسقة الأمم المتحدة المقيمة، وبالنيابة أيضا عن الجامعة الأردنية، نشكركم جزيل الشكر على هذا الحضور. سيكون الغداء في الحديقة الشتوية The Winter Garden في الطابق الرئيسي. شكرا جزيلا لكم، شرفتمونا جميعا.